Welcome to the New Brunswick Debrief, where we will talk to people living in New Brunswick about the pressing issues facing our communities, and where we will provide an alternative to the corporate media monopoly. Our show will cover stories about communities from across the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Wolastoqey that now make up New Brunswick. My name is Tobin Haley, and I will be your host. This is our very first show. The New Brunswick Debrief is a partnership between the NB Media Co-op and Charlotte County Television, two independent media outlets in New Brunswick. The NB Media Co-op was founded in 2009 by community members from across the left. These community members were concerned about the impact of governmental and commercial pressures on media outlets in the province. The NB Media Co-op accepts no commercial or government funding and is run entirely by volunteers committed to social justice. At the New Brunswick Debrief, our mission is simple: to offer a much-needed critical take on pressing social, economic, political, and cultural issues in the province. As with all NB Media Co-op content, at the core of this show is a commitment to social justice and to covering issues and perspectives erased in mainstream commercial media. For our very first show, you're going to hear from NB Media Co-op contributors. They are going to talk about some of those neglected news stories, the necessity of independent news outlets in this province, and about the importance of a critical and rigorous public discourse to challenge corporate narratives in New Brunswick. First, I'll be talking to Susan O'Donnell. Susan is a researcher, writer, and activist based in Fredericton. She writes for the New Brunswick Media Co-op, mostly on labor, environmental, and feminist issues. When the provincial legislature is in session, she writes a weekly political column on Opposition Day. Susan, talk to us about some of the recent media pieces that you feel did not get enough attention in the mainstream commercial media press.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Tobin. I'll talk about some labor stories because I think labor issues are among the most interesting that the NB Media Co-op is covering right now. Certainly for the next few years and last year since the Higgs austerity government came in, we'd want to look at public sector workers and relations with the public sector. For all austerity governments, they believe that the easiest way to cut costs is to cut public services and public sector wages. And so that's where the conflicts are going to be. And we've certainly seen this since the Higgs government came in, for sure. And when we're talking about public sector, really what we want to focus on is the Canadian Union of Public Employees, or CUPE, which is the largest public sector union in Canada, certainly, and also in New Brunswick, where CUPE represents 30,000 workers roughly in many areas across the public sector. So what we saw over the last year, and some great coverage that NB Media Co-op was able to contribute, was two particular stories that involved CUPE workers. And in labor relations, the most extreme form of breakdown is strikes and lockouts, and we had two of them last year. CUPE 508 was the first one. They're the outside workers working for the city of Fredericton. And that one was really interesting. The city actually locked out the workers, and then they immediately brought in scabs, but they'd obviously planned this in advance because the scabs were ready to roll the next morning, basically.
Susan, can you talk a little bit about how the mainstream media coverage treated the Red Pine workers?
Oh, sure. Great question, Tobin. As far as I know, the Brunswick News did not cover that situation at all. The CBC, I believe, CBC English had one story. Acadie Nouvelle had a couple stories toward the end. I think the best coverage was on Radio Canada. The problem, well, the Brunswick News is no surprise. They're actively hostile to labor and unions, absolutely, and they particularly do not want to have a situation, having to cover a situation where the workers are holding the line, for example. They were holding a picket line or standing firm. I'll just tell you a little bit about that situation. What the management, the reason they closed down and locked out the workers is they were trying to do one thing around sick leave, which was kind of crazy, but the other thing that they were trying to do is to limit the time that the president of the union could spend away from work on union meetings. And I have to say that when the president of a union like CUPE is away from work for union meetings, CUPE covers his salary. So it does not cost the employer anything for this, okay? But if they can limit the time, then they can limit the strength of the union. And so CUPE was holding firm on this one. They want the union to be able to organize. This is really clear. The union has to be able to organize. And if the employer can limit the amount of time that the union can take to actually do the organizing, then obviously that puts them in a position of strength. And so that's why the union was holding firm on this one. And the president was very strong about this. And obviously that's, something Brunswick News would not want to cover, showing union strength. But there was better coverage from the Francophone media, which is really consistent across labor. I've noticed over the last couple of years is the Francophone media does a much better job of it. But still, you have employers who have to file a story by 5 o'clock that day. They don't necessarily know the background. Sometimes it's a rotating, it's not the same reporter covering the story. And I have to say that the first story that Acadie Nouvelle filed on this situation, they just reprinted a media release from the employer. And this is the problem. So the employer is pumping out this stuff from their perspective, but it looks respectable. It's, hey, in this case, it's a public sector, social services commission. And so they just reprint the media release. Well, of course, that doesn't include the workers' voices. And so that's why the NB Media Co-op focused on the workers' voices. We did certainly interviews over the phone. I did with the union president, but we also went up there to Allardville to meet the workers on the picket line, and were able to do some really good interviews there. One in particular, I think that was really popular, talked about the impact that this is having in the community, and especially hiring scabs from neighboring regions, and just how damaging this is to community when you have the employer acting like this in a really underhanded manner.
Susan, would you say that the workers were excited to talk to you when you were doing those interviews, given the way that they were being treated by Brunswick News?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, workers were happy to see. And I should say that whenever we filed and whenever NB Media Co-op published a story, we were able to share it on social media, and there was huge uptake of them. They were certainly shared among the workers' families. And we got all kinds of notes of appreciation from workers' families for the coverage we were doing, because there's nothing more frustrating. I mean, this is in the dead of winter. When they first had to go to the picket line, it was something like 30 below out there. And I'm talking about a rural road, a windy road, and they're out there on the picket line, no support, nobody's up there. And, so having some coverage and having people speak up for them, like the NB Media Co-op was doing, telling their stories, was just so important for morale, that they weren't just alone up there on this cold road, in the middle of rural New Brunswick.
Susan, that's a really good point about the importance of independent media here in New Brunswick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tobin.
And next, we're going to be talking to Tracy, Glynn, and Matthew Hayes about the importance of independent media here in this province, and about the importance of a rigorous public discourse to counter corporate narratives.
Of course, independent media is important for a healthy democracy. In New Brunswick, we have a situation where one corporation doesn't just own the media, but is also controls much of the industry in the province. So J.D. Irving owns the media, as well as one of the Irving group of companies also controls much of the oil, forestry, manufacturing industry. And these are industries that require public scrutiny, investigative journalism, but we can't expect the Irving media to cover the stories that it should. In New Brunswick, the Brunswick News, that's owned by J.D. Irving Ltd, owns all the English daily newspapers, the Telegraph Journal, the Times and Transcript, the Daily Gleaner, as well as many community newspapers like Victoria Star, Kings County Record, Miramichi Leader. Acadia Broadcasting, that's owned by another Irving company, owns a dozen radio stations in New Brunswick as well as Nova Scotia. And oftentimes, what we all feel, which is also backed by research on the content of what's in Irving's newspapers, is that their editorial lines will say that what's good for the province is what's good for Irving, and we know that to not be the case. So in New Brunswick, it's very important that we have a media that's not just independent, but also has a bias that's on the side of workers, on the side of social justice, and I think that's what the NB Media Co-op is working hard to do.
Matthew, you're a longtime contributor to the NB Media Co-op. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of a public discourse in New Brunswick that challenges the corporate narratives?
Yeah, well, I think the thing in New Brunswick is, what's unique about New Brunswick is that business classes are really oriented towards a narrative that is generated by one family that owns most of the industry in the province. And the Irvings also are, since 1972, they've been located primarily in Bermuda, not in New Brunswick. All of the activity happens here in New Brunswick, but the family itself and their financial interests are offshore. And that changes the business consensus within the province. The kind of business classes in New Brunswick are oriented towards this one family who are offshore. This has a really profound influence on the type of stories that are told about New Brunswick and what the reality is in New Brunswick. So, the fact that you have this one offshore family that is really dominates what the stories are, what the news are, is quite important to the agenda, the public agenda. So owning newspapers and talking about the news is also about what are our problems, how are we going to go about solving those problems, whose problems are they? And if they're dominated from one perspective, then we get a distorted view of what those problems are and how to go about it. We get a distorted view also of who we are as a province. So we're continuously told, for instance, that New Brunswick is a poor province. From a certain angle, that might be true, but New Brunswick is also somehow, as even a small province, able to produce two of the largest family fortunes in all of Canada, the Irvings and the McCains. Really, the reality of our province is that we're a highly unequal province, where the benefits of our industrial base are not distributed evenly to everyone. And that reality is oftentimes left out of the frame. Having an NB Media Co-op actually that's able to kind of bring some of that reality into the frame and tell stories about how many of our challenges are not being told, right? Our challenges, like, for instance, 1 in 5 children in the province live below the poverty line, which would be 1 in 3 if it weren't for the federal child tax benefit, which was brought in 2016. These are huge problems. And instead, what we have are media that are telling us that, as Susan said just a minute ago, that civil servants are overpaid. And the problem here is not that civil servants are overpaid. The problem here is that we have huge economic disparities and injustice, and we don't even have much of a public discussion about how to fix them.
Yeah. So Tracy, Matthew's talked obviously about the importance of an independent media. You also mentioned the importance of an independent media in challenging the Irvings and the discourse that what is good for the Irvings is good for the province. It's clear the NB Media Co-op is doing a lot of the heavy lifting around that. Can you talk a little bit about how the NB Media Co-op came around? Because if I remember correctly, it's now in its 12th year.
In 2008, a group of us organized a New Brunswick Social Forum, which was an event held in Fredericton that brought together 200 people from across the province who rooted in various social justice movements, and we all felt that the media was a problem. So out of that forum, we formed a working group on the media. We then, inspired by the National Media Co-op, we decided to form the New Brunswick Media Co-op, and we felt that the co-op model was the most democratic way to produce and disseminate media. So yes, we are in our 12th year. And just to also say, the year before, why we also chose the co-op model is that the year before the founding of the MB Media Co-op, a small newspaper in Woodstock, the Carleton Free Press, was shut down because the local Irving newspaper there used aggressive legal tactics. They also slashed their advertising rates for their newspaper temporarily in order to shut down this newspaper. So knowing that we could not compete, but also inspired by co-ops, we decided to form the MB Media Co-op, and so we have a website that daily produces news, and we also have the broadsheet, the brief, which is put out in cafes and clinics across the province. 25,000 people read our most popular stories every month. So, and we hope that this show will also be part of growing our readership too. And we also want to, it's about people writing the stories of their lives. So we cultivate journalists, wannabe journalists. So if people are not sure about writing a news story, one of our editors will work with you to get it into a form that's important and that is readable and that the writer is happy about.
If I remember correctly, everything is rigorously vetted.
Yes,
before it's printed.
We have an editorial board that has an anti-oppressive lens too, so we want to make sure that the stories are not in any way oppressing a group of people, which our corporate media tends to do all the time. Mm-hmm. When we talk about land, oftentimes in the corporate media, when we talk about land or natural resources, the indigenous peoples are not even mentioned. The rightful owners of the land. Also, like issues like climate change and racism get treated like there's a debate, and the MB Media Co-op, as well as other independent media, don't treat it as such, and report on it in a way that doesn't maintain an oppressive status quo, which we feel like other corporate media does.
Yeah, and it's membership month, right? March is membership month.
So March is membership month, and you can sign up at the mbmediacoop.org.
Yes, and get up-to-date stories on all of the things that are happening in New Brunswick from a lens that is different and alternative to the corporate media narrative that we're seeing, or the commercial media narrative that we're seeing.
Yes, for sure.
And Matthew, just going back to you, can you talk a little bit about why this kind of independent media and this kind of critical discourse is so important in New Brunswick right now? Obviously, it's always been important in New Brunswick. Obviously, the Irvings have had a long monopoly on the media here in the province. But what is it about right now that we're living through these tumultuous political times?
Well, there's a sense of crisis. There's been a sense of crisis for a number of years, and you see that reflected in the public debate. But what's the consensus about what the crisis is? So again, if we go back to how representing what our public problems are, how we're going to resolve them, and whose problems are they? The kind of consensus that has developed is that we are facing we're a small province that's facing a declining population. So our demographic issues we need to be mindful of. We're an aging population, and we need to be careful that the population doesn't end up shrinking. And in the process, I think the consensus around this is that this would cause a tax burden issue for New Brunswickers. So this is kind of the mainstream approach that both main political parties, are orienting towards. And if they want to be, kind of taken seriously, they have to find a way into this narrative of the province. Now, there's some truth to this narrative. However, how we are a small province, we are an aging population. I think really important to remember is that we're not the only province that's aging. And if we compare internationally to other countries in the OECD, there are lots of regions like New Brunswick. New Brunswick's far from being in the worst condition. It's far from being in the best. So we have all kinds of people that we could look at and compare with. But I think what's missing is kind of a focus on the root causes of some of these issues. So why do we have some of these problems? Why are we a declining population? And again, if we start shifting the frame back to, well, what are our problems really in terms of this declining population? It's gross inequality, and it's all the other deficits, not just the economic ones. You know, the high tax burden, that's a thing. Homeowners in New Brunswick are faced with a relatively high tax burden, but how did we get there? And how is it that coexists with some massively favorable tax breaks for, again, the wealthiest families in the province, starting with the Irvings? Robert Jones at CBC has done some really great reporting showing how the province and the city of St. John are losing millions of dollars every year in taxes from their industrial base, and not just their industrial base. Also, the new headquarters is assessed at about 2/3 of its value. Imagine if your house could be assessed at 2/3 of its value. Of course, anyone would love that. But why is it that the people who are at the top of the food chain in this province seem to be able to get away with those tax breaks again and again and again? And that's the reason why we're dealing with rising tax issues for everyone else. So then the fiscal issue becomes, well, you know, we can't afford to have enough nurses. We can't afford to have enough doctors. We can't afford to have an education system that does better than basically teaching half of our kids to read, because the other half apparently end up as functionally illiterate. You know, we can't afford to bring down the level of child poverty. The alternative to this, obviously, is that we deal with the root causes of this issue, which is the injustice and gross inequality in this province that we deal with. How do we expect kids who are growing up in poverty to be able to do as well at school? If we deal with the poverty issue, we're also dealing with the education issue. How do we expect the population to stay healthy if we're not investing in public health, if we're not ensuring that we have an adequate number of nurses? How do we expect to provide an environment in which people are aging, in good health, happy, experiencing third and fourth age to their fullest potential, when we have staffing shortages in our long-term care facilities? So the only way that we can address some of these things actually is to go to the root causes, and the root causes are about unequal and unfair distribution of the benefits of our industrial economy.
I feel like you've been dancing around the issue of trickle-down economics a little bit, and the discourse of trickle-down economics that is, in my view, very much apparent in a lot of the media coverage that we get in the province. Can you speak to that a little bit? Would you agree or disagree?
Well, yeah, I think the idea, as Tracy pointed out, is that what's good for Irving is good for the province, and that is objectively not the case. What was good for the province in the 1960s, if we remember, was the Equal Opportunities Agenda, which lifted a lot of the province out of extreme poverty. It was the bringing in of Medicare. New Brunswick was the last province to bring in Medicare, and Irving opposition to Medicare played a role in that. One of the reasons why K.C. Irving decided to move to Bermuda and force his sons to be residents of Bermuda in order to inherit his fortune was because he was opposed to taking on the fiscal burden of this expanding bureaucracy, what he perceived as an expanding bureaucracy in the 1960s. What he wanted was a game, basically, in which he held all the cards, and in which the natural evolution of economic competition was going to benefit him. And I think that we're at a particular moment in time where people like K.C. Irving have benefited tremendously from the economic expansion of the last 50, 60, 100 years, but a lot of other people who have helped to make that fortune are now getting tossed aside. Right. And so, again, that sense of crisis at this particular moment and what we're going to do to confront some of what's happening, we're going to have to also have a different narrative about what the problem is so that we can get at what the root causes are and make sure that we, are not moving forward into a bleak future. I don't think anybody wants that, right? We want to address climate change. We want to address growing inequalities and injustice. And the game we've been playing for the last, with neoliberal capitalism over the last 40 years is just not working. We need to shift entirely our paradigms. We need to shift towards something very different than what we're on.
And an independent media outlets play a big role in shifting those paradigms in the public sphere. Tracy, would you agree with that? I feel like you've said some of that already.
Yes, and I think the Media Coop also does a good job of reminding us of all the good and solidarity between different groups of people, which I think oftentimes when we are reading the Irving media, we're told that New Brunswick is just this like drive-through province where nobody cares, nothing ever changes, and that's not true. And so yeah, I think by having a media that's focused on social justice, about transforming society in a way that we can all live and thrive, is so important.
And just Matthew was talking a little bit about some of the issues of inequality that are left out of the mainstream media coverage in the province. I know that one of your areas of expertise, one of the areas you cover a lot, is the environment and environmental justice. And knowing you and knowing the kind of work you do, I also know that some of the issues related to the environmental crises that we see in the province are left out of the mainstream media coverage. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work in covering those environmental issues.
Yeah, well, like one of the issues that many people, in this province, is opposed to is the spraying of glyphosate on our public forest. So JD Irving is the largest sprayer of glyphosate, and New Brunswick's the forestry industry in New Brunswick is also the largest user of glyphosate on the forest. So we don't see. We do see the coverage of it a little bit. What we have found is that they have delayed coverage of the opposition to glyphosate, and they only have started covering it because there are other media outlets like the MB Media Co-op covering it. They've also, the opposition has grown to the point where they can't ignore it. But if the media should be doing its job, and if they were doing their job, I think we would have a ban on glyphosate. There's other Irving, for example, their mine in near Hampton that many of us felt contravened provincial regulations. That was not covered in the Irving media. Their RCMP surveillance of people opposed to that mine was not covered in the Irving media. So there's many environmental issues. They totally ignore the fact that we get coal from Colombia that's involved in the displacement of Indigenous and Afro-Colombian people, where people are dying because of our coal. It's completely not covered. And so I think, these are all issues that, if they were covering it, we can ask whether, maybe we would be off coal by now, or maybe people in Colombia wouldn't be dying for our coal use.
Thank you so much, Tracy and Matthew, for being here today. And that's our show. Thank you so much for joining us. Tune in next time. We have lots of exciting topics coming up: housing issues, abortion, language rights. And if you have an idea, you can email us at thedebrief@chco.tv and visit us at nbmediacoop.org. See you next time.
No downtown is from this town, long walk, long and clean now. Yes, it is, yes, it is, yes, it is. Company keeps out the company, they say.